for Henry Schein, Arrow Electronics, two Fortune 200 companies. The work that I do it's corporate M&A, a lot of inward investment work, a lot of private mergers and acquisitions work, joint ventures, and it's always a pleasure, of course, dealing with businesses in India. We are fortunate also that even with the current crisis, our work has not stopped. We're engaged in 3 or 4 M&A deals at the moment, inward investment from Germany, other places, and acquisitions for one of our US clients. My partner Bibi will tell you about our property practice, but we're fortunate we act for a number of listed companies and major family businesses with substantial property portfolios in London and the UK. One of our clients is Soho Estates, and Soho Estates owns a very large part of the West End of London, London's theatre district, which unfortunately at the moment is closed for business. We do employment, business immigration, all types of commercial work. We have a very heavyweight commercial litigation practice, and currently we're engaged in some group litigation against MasterCard. So let's look at the, I describe this as the current COVID scenario, but the scenario is changing. I just want to give you a bit of the history. You'll be familiar with some of it. So like a lot of countries, you know, people started hearing about COVID in January and February and didn't take it seriously. We didn't take it seriously in the UK, and the lockdown decision that was taken came too late. It was March, the middle, last part of March that we locked down. We've been working from home since the 18th, about the 25th of March, I think, was ordered a full lockdown. So as a result, we have quite high infection and death rates relative to other countries. We've got just over 300,000 people have been infected. 43,000 people, unfortunately, have died. It's a very high number. There was a big concern that the hospitals would be overwhelmed, and some emergency steps were put in place. Fortunately, that was not the case. And although hospitals, I would say at the beginning of the crisis, were treating only COVID patients, now the number of patients in hospitals in London has gone down dramatically, and other places also. Very, very few patients left actually in hospitals. So it's no secret to say that COVID has had a very significant economic effect, very big drop in activity in almost every single sector. The worst affected sectors here have been travel, leisure, entertainment, manufacturing, and retail, the major retailers in the high street in particular. So interesting, I mean, the airlines have been particularly badly hit, the cruise lines, the hotels, and we've had a lot of the airlines have been consulting about laying off, making redundant very large numbers of staff. Interesting, the effect that COVID has had on particular individuals, and I just want to tell you about an interesting matter that I was involved in. Some people go on a holiday for a week or 2 weeks. We had a particular client in the US, an extremely wealthy individual who chartered a yacht in Europe for June, 2-week charter for €500,000. So he thought back in April that this wasn't going to happen. We were asked to get involved, and the force majeure clause there didn't operate. And we successfully negotiated with the Australian company that chartered the vessel a renegotiation of the charter, and that's going to take place next year now. So some people have a week's holiday or 2 weeks holiday. Our guy had a 2-week luxury yacht charter. So not all businesses have been absolutely affected. Fortunately, professional services, we're working from home. and we've had a drop in activity, but generally we've stayed working. And then financial services companies, logistics companies, a number of other businesses have managed to stay and working more or less normally, working from home. But
I would like to ask one thing: the professionals or the people who, because London is a very cosmopolitan place, there are a lot of people working across the globe in London. So during this COVID, they stayed in London or they went back? What was the situation?
Well, some people went back when they thought there was going to be a problem and they didn't want to get locked in. But other people got stranded. I know of people who've been stranded. I had a client who he was a London resident. He was one of our high net worth clients, became non-resident, and was limited to the number of days that he was allowed to spend in the UK. He came to London to stay with his family, and then he couldn't move until I think a week or 2 weeks ago. So he was allowed to spend only 90 days here. He ended up spending well in excess of that figure. In those circumstances, the government said it was exceptional circumstance. It's not going to affect his tax position. He's only now been able to go. He has homes in several countries in the world. None of those countries would allow him in. They all had bars on allowing in residents, and he's now enjoying time in a spa in Austria until you could go to one of his other properties. I have an Indian client who's based in Singapore. His family were in Mumbai, and he couldn't leave Singapore for months to be with them. So it's affected a lot of people, Samir. So just moving on, general effect of the economy in the UK, the last published figures were for April, showed a 20% drop in GDP, massively greater than the financial crisis, massive drop. The government here has introduced several job retention and what's called a furlough scheme for employees. Daniel will say more about this, but it's a scheme to assist employees, employers. It's allowed employers to furlough employees, and the government has picked up 80% of their salaries up to a level. It's provided assistance for self-employed people earning up to a certain level. It's not a high level, but it's allowed people to continue to live. There's a loan guarantee scheme for small businesses. A lot of people have taken up. We've had a lot of small clients who have taken these loan guarantee schemes, and that's a fiscal support package, which is equal to about 6% of GDP. Very high. So, you know, we had Boris.
This loan guarantee scheme for small, this is available to all or to UK businesses? I mean, if suppose Indians are going, they have their, so it's to all businesses or is limited to local businesses?
It's limited. It's an interesting question. It's limited to businesses which are incorporated in the UK.
Okay. I mean, it is immaterial whether the company may be owned by an Indian or any other person in the Asia. So they will get this, but the company must be incorporated in UK.
Incorporated. It has to be a UK business. It's been interesting because the furlough scheme, it applies to any business, and we have furlough. We have companies in the UK. We'll talk about this later, but we have companies which are foreign owned. I mean, sometimes those owners may be UK people who've gone non-resident, maybe billionaires, and living in Monaco or somewhere else, and their businesses have taken advantage of the furlough scheme. So that's provoked a little bit of controversy that the very wealthy individual owners, non-resident taxpayers, and some other foreign owners have taken advantage of this UK scheme. But the purpose of the scheme is to stimulate the economy, or not necessarily to stimulate, but to prevent catastrophe in the economy. So 6% GDP is a very substantial introduction of fiscal support, and it's one of the strongest levels of support, I think, worldwide. So, you know, some businesses have been very well affected. Online sales, Anyone who follows Amazon will see their share price has gone through the roof. All the businesses doing online selling are doing quite well. Food and wine has gone up considerably. People are at home and they're eating better, cooking better, and certainly drinking a lot more. I think alcohol sales are 40% up. Yeah. So they may not have work, but at least they're happy.
So I was speaking to somebody in US. They told me that people realized that how much money they are spending on Starbucks, just going out of catching up coffee. So now they have realized and they are taking coffee and cookies from their home, and now they know that, so they have spent a huge, they have saved a huge money. Starbucks has suddenly gone down in US.
Yeah, well, that's going to be one of the effects, because people are changing the way they live. And I think it's been noticeable that people have been spending more time on cooking. They've been spending more time on food, and they're going to be spending more time working from home. So, if you walk down the high street in the UK, you could see 5 or 6 coffee shops within 100, 200 meters. Be interesting to see what happens post lockdown. So will be interesting. And last note is the technology is doing well. Pharmaceuticals is obviously going to be a growth area. This next slide is a bit misleading because I say post-COVID future. I think we're only going to see really a post-COVID future when we have a proper vaccine in place. And I don't know when that's going to be. When I say post-COVID, what I'm talking about really a post-lockdown, when there's a relaxation of the strict rules. So just talking about vaccines, I'm pleased to say that in the UK, 2 of the world leading contenders for vaccine are from Oxford University and Imperial College, and they're now well into, or they're starting trials of those vaccines. So we'll see how that goes. But as I said, we've got a government stimulation package, we've got the furlough scheme, other scheme for self-employed. That is gradually going to be phased out. So what is going to happen? We've already had a consultation process for redundancies, a number of companies. If you make mass redundancies, you have to start consultation. And British Airways, Rolls-Royce, a number of other major businesses have been consulting about some significant redundancies of many thousands of people. It's almost inevitable that once the support scheme is phased out, that will continue. We've started the release from lockdown, but how soon consumer confidence returns and people start spending money on discretionary spending, it remains to be seen. So there's been some opening of retail stores, restaurants, hotels, and some opening of the sports and leisure sector. So the Football League has restarted in England. And for those of you who are interested, for the Liverpool supporters, you'll know that Liverpool won the league yesterday after 30 years.
Okay. So who is the lead player in Liverpool? Who is the lead player?
Well, Daniel, who do you think? Mo Salah? Yeah, okay. We'll go for Mo Salah. They've got a great team. Interesting. I mean, the manager is Jurgen Klopp, so not a British, they're German. It's the English Football League is like the United Nations now.
Yes.
So, but they're playing in empty stadiums. Next week, the hairdressers are going to open. I think a lot of people are going to be relieved by that. Tennis has restarted, but you can't play cricket. So I know that'll disappoint a lot of people in India. We've got very hot weather here. Yesterday, I told you, Samir, we had in one of the beaches in the south of the country, Bournemouth Beach, 500,000 people decided they would go and visit the beach. So that caused chaos on the beaches in the city, traffic jams.
Without mask and no social distancing.
no mask, no social distancing. They weren't wearing no mask. They weren't wearing very much at all.
Okay.
So, you know, people need to be careful, need to be sensible, because otherwise we're going to get a second spike.
Yeah.
I mean, social distancing is still advised 2 meters, but it's reduced to 1 meter in circumstances. Restaurants that have opened are putting up screens to separate people. We've got a relaxation of planning laws. So a lot of the restaurants will be allowed to set up tables on the streets and outside. So the government hasn't fully announced this yet, but it's forecast that they're going to put in place a stimulation package of £100 billion, very significant, with support from the Bank of England. The Bank of England has been buying government debt, and we now have a situation where government debt is, I think, is about 100.4% of GDP, which is the first time in a long, long time that it's gone in excess of GDP. In America, interesting, it's 140% government debt there. I don't know how many trillions, but it's 140% of GDP. So a few days ago, the IMF projected, and it was a projection by economists, so, you know, one can take this as you see it, but the IMF projected that we would have a 10% drop in GDP for the current year, and it would go up by 6.3% in 2021. So they're forecasting an increase, which actually is better than most of the Eurozone. I think, yeah, virtually, I think bigger than the Eurozone. So, you know, we've been all been working from home. A lot of people have been working from home for the first time. They've not been used to it. And there's definitely going to be a change in the way people work. We carried out a survey of people in the office. A lot of people have said that they would like to continue working from home in the future. A number of companies have said to their employees they're allowed to work from home permanently. And there's going to be a big change in how we work, I think, particularly in the service sector in the future. And of course, the UK, London in particular, has got a large service industry, not only professional staff, but other services. And that's going to mean there's a change in requirement for space and the type of space that people occupy. How the offices are going to be laid out, what type of facilities are provided. It's going to mean it's going to have an effect on landlords. Bibi will talk about this, but there will be a change also, because people are going to need more technology, better facilities. So there'll be rent savings and technology expenditure. I think we're going to have a permanent reduction in business travel. So we're participating in this webinar. We're taking advantage of the technology. I personally have had 4 or 5 trips cancelled. I was due to be in Milan on business, Mexico on business, all cancelled. Another trip to the US has been cancelled. And going forward, I think that a lot of people are going to say that they're not going to fly halfway around the world for a 1 hour or 1 day, 2 day business meeting. They're going to be more remote meetings taking place, and that will have a permanent impact on the airline industry. So just quickly, growth areas, technology, health services, pharmaceuticals, logistics. So we have a logistics client who's expanding their facility at the moment. We've just been advising them on that, assisting them with new bank lending on expansion. And then serviced offices. Again, Bibi will talk about this in more detail, but one of the biggest tenants, the biggest users of space in London at the moment, it's going to serviced office providers rather than just commercial clients. I don't suppose we can have any conversation about business in Britain without talking about a subject, Brexit.
Yeah.
So, you know, for the last 3 years, up until the end of 2019, Brexit was the only news that there was. You could watch the news in the evening and you'd have 25 minutes of Brexit and 5 minutes about everything else.
David, here, before proceeding further in this, I would like you to spend 1 or 2 seconds to explain to the audience what is Brexit, because
Okay.
there may be few audience who don't know about it and how, but it may be impacting Indian businesses or other businesses there. So 1 or 2 seconds, just a very, very short 1 or 2 lines. What is Brexit?
Sure, of course. I mean, Brexit is a subject that, you know, we could take the whole webinar to speak about. But so the UK joined the what was called the Common Market way back in 1972, and that's metamorphosed into the European Community, now the European Union, of which there are 28 members, including the UK. And we had a referendum in 2016 about leaving the European Union. We have a political party here, UKIP, UK Independence Party. They had a very charismatic leader, Nigel Farage, and he put a lot of pressure on the main political parties to say, you know, we need to leave the EU, it's too political, we've given up our sovereignty to the European Court of Justice, and we need to take back control. So David Cameron agreed that when he was Prime Minister that he would have a referendum, I think, in order to take off the pressure of UKIP, voting pressure, because it was a large part of the electorate were supporting him. And so he said, yes, we'll have a referendum. We had a referendum in 2016, and nobody, I think, at the time in the mainstream political parties or in Europe thought that a leave vote would be obtained. There were some negotiations that year with the European Union about largely around immigration, because we were getting mass immigration, not only from largely from Eastern Europe, but also a lot of immigration was coming in because of the turmoil in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, and other parts of the Middle East. A lot of people were making their way into the EU, into Greece and Italy, and then making their way to France. And they all wanted to come to, or a large number of them wanted to come to the UK. Anyway, so we had our referendum, and in 2016, in June, and much, I think, to the surprise of many people, including Nigel Farage, who looked like he was preparing his speech on the evening to say, well, we had a good try, but we didn't win. So we had a referendum vote, which was 52 in favor of leaving, 48 against. That caused political chaos for 3 years. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, resigned. We had a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, not very effective. She couldn't negotiate. She didn't have the strength to negotiate. Anyway, we had an election last year. So Theresa May resigned. Boris Johnson, who some of you will recognize, was elected as Prime Minister. And at that time, particularly at the last part of last year, I think the country was in a state of political paralysis as to when we were going to leave and on what terms. So we had an election in December, and the decision to leave was taken, was endorsed. We negotiated a transitional period up until the 31st December of this year.
So after 31st December, UK will be out of European Union.
UK will be out, and there's been a lot of suggestion that we should extend the transitional period because of COVID and the inability to negotiate a deal with Europe. But there's not going to be an extension. So in 6 months' time, we will be leaving.
So once you are out of European Union, then what happens now? at the moment there is no requirement for visa, people can travel freely, so it continues or that stops?
Well, that's a very good question, Samir. Now, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be a very clever person. So,
but there are a lot of Indians who are residing in Europe, UK, so they are frequently traveling. So just question is coming. So what happens to that?
Okay, so one of the fundamental principles of the European Union is freedom of movement. Movement of people, movement of capital, movement of services. And so any one who is an EU citizen is free to move and work in any EU country. So there are about 3 million EU citizens working in the UK. London is the 5th biggest French city. There are 300,000 or 400,000 French in London. So that automatic right will come to an end. I think one point that is going to be absolutely certain is that anyone who's here at the moment will have grandfather rights. I don't think anyone's going to be thrown out, and I don't think that will apply in reverse in Europe. But there is going to be a new regime in terms of the immigration of people from Europe, and so anyone from Europe will be treated as the same as anyone from the rest of the world. Same as some of you from India or Japan or China or anywhere else in the world.
So do you think this Brexit would have any impact on Indian companies who are doing business in UK or something like that?
Okay, so I think maybe in 2 ways. Firstly, we have a lot of people set up in the UK. Companies are established, foreign companies established in the UK as a bridge to Europe. So if you're in a manufacturing business, then and you're dealing a lot of import and export from Europe, you might find that it's definitely going to be more difficult. You're not going to have until there's a free trade agreement, we don't know what is going to be the position in terms of tariffs and in terms of formality. I think certainly in the start of 2021, it's likely that there's going to be a period of uncertainty and some delays at the ports, imports and exports. So companies which are heavily reliant on trading as between the UK and Europe in terms of manufactured goods might look to open a subsidiary in continental Europe. There's been a big issue in terms of the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland and checking goods. That's a very big subject. We won't have time to go into that. But the other point, though, I would make is this, that a big argument that people have raised in terms of trading is that, yes, the EU is our biggest single market, but there's a very big world around, and India's seen as a major market. So I think there's going to be a lot of big attempt to forge better deals with India, other countries in Asia. Yeah.
Okay.
One big issue for us is financial services. So if we leave without a deal, then the theory is, well, not only the theory, the law is that we won't be able to do financial service business. It's not going to be regulated under EU rules. 70% of all of European financial trading, 70% of all trading takes place in London. So we have Paris, we have Dublin, we have Frankfurt, which are established financial centers in their own right. And it's true that people have moved, set up either new offices, moved staff to some of these places. But last year was still a huge amount of inward investment into the UK in financial services, more inward investment into the UK in financial services than in the rest of Europe. And the European companies and businesses are going to need access to the capital markets, and they're going to get them in London. If they don't get them in London, then they're more likely to go to New York or Hong Kong than go to Paris or Frankfurt. So I think that there will be a deal here, because it's not in Europe's interest, it's certainly not in our interest to have no deal. And I think that will drive the politicians to come to some sort of arrangement. It's probably a last minute arrangement, but probably for financial services, they'll work under the equivalence rules, which are not ideal, but the European Union can say that you can still do business if your rules are largely equivalent to our rules. And currently the rules are aligned. So that looks like an easy temporary solution on financial services. There's a lot of negotiation going on with, say, with India, the US, Japan, a lot of other countries to enter into new free trade agreements. It's not been helped by the COVID crisis, so there have been some virtual meetings carrying on. It's going to take time. I mean, it takes years to negotiate free trade agreements. So I think it's going to be several years before the dust settles and we know what the final position is going to be. I mentioned a couple of companies here as interesting examples. Unilever, I don't know whether people are familiar with Unilever. It's Unilever is a company that was established 90, 100 years ago. So, excuse me. So some of the brands you'll be familiar are Ben & Jerry's, Bovrils, Coleman's Cornettos, Hellmann's Mayonnaise, a lot of Marmite, a lot of well-known food brands, Lipton's Tea, Lion's Tea, and a lot of other domestic products, household cleaning products. So it's a huge company which has had a dual corporate structure, quite an unusual dual corporate structure between London and the UK and the Netherlands. And there was some suggestion last year that it was going to close its London headquarters and move entirely to the Netherlands and Rotterdam, where it has headquarters. That didn't go ahead. And one of the reasons it didn't go ahead was because most investors said, we're not happy with this. We have to have a London Stock Exchange quotation to be investing in you. And Unilever last week announced that it was closing the Rotterdam headquarters and moving it entirely to London, which is interesting in the current climate. We have a lot of car manufacturing, Japanese car manufacturing takes place here. Nissan, a few weeks ago, announced that it's going to be moving part of its manufacturing from Spain to the
we have a few questions also for you, so we have to go fast because we have other speakers also waiting for it. So
okay, let me. I told you Brexit was a big topic.
Yes,
so
yes. But it is very important for people to know how things, because it is really impacting, as you told, it is impacting the business who are trying to use it as a trade link. It is really impacting that.
Absolutely. So relocation to the UK. Let's move quickly now to the main business, and I'll try and be quick. Okay, so what can we offer in the UK? A stable political environment. Last year we had chaos in our parliament, but the British people are quite sensible, and some of the political parties were just causing absolute mayhem and not allowing any positive votes. And they were given a bit of a hiding in these political parties, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, in the last election. So it's a very business-friendly environment, and I think there are going to be more incentives offered to set up business after Brexit. The World Bank rates the UK second in the G7 after the US as a place to do business. I'll talk about the corporate structures that we offer. Daniel will talk about our labour laws. And we have a common law system here, which is used in large parts of the world, and which I think is it's a well-established system. It's a well-established court system. The matter I mentioned to you about the yacht charter, it was a US client chartering a yacht in Europe with an Australian company, and the yacht broker was in Monaco, and it was governing law in England. And another advantage we have is the time zone, because I think England, we're well placed as a bridge between the US and Asia. I've got to mention, from a point of view of London, we've got great culture, fantastic restaurants here. We've got great theatres when they reopen. We've got great parks, and it's a nice place to live and do business. So if you're thinking of setting up in the UK, what are the sort of corporate structures you could use? The two main structures are limited companies, which you have in India. Your company law was originally based on our company law, so you'll be familiar with this, and the limited liability partnership. So if you're going to set up a company, we could do that for you in one day. In some parts of excuse me, in some parts of Europe, it can take weeks to set up a new company.
So here, David, there are a few questions. Mostly when Indians are coming, what kind of entity they are forming? Whenever Indians are coming there or Indian companies are coming, what kind of entity they are forming there?
Most businesses will carry on business through a limited company.
Limited company. Or
with which you're familiar.
Yeah. So when you're forming the limited company, like in India, and the people are required to come there to form the company, or they can simply give you instructions and you can form there, or they are required to be there to form this company?
We can do that remotely. So we're still setting up companies. We can do it remotely, online, and there were ways of registering using the online system that we're registered for. So
for setting up company, we need not to come there and do sign papers or whatever like that.
No, we could do it. We can do that all remotely.
Oh, and do you need any person or a director resident in London or UK to form a company? Or like in India, we have a regulation that you need a director resident in India. So
no, if you look down, as I say, there's no restriction on foreign directors, no requirement for only UK directors. We have there were no minimum share requirements, so you could set up a company with £1 or £2 of share capital. Okay. The only thing I would say is that from a tax point of view, we have what are called thin capitalization rules, where if you set up a company with £1 of share capital and £1 million of debt, you won't get tax relief on the interest of your £1 million of debt. There are restrictions on how much tax relief you can claim.
So is there any restriction on shareholding? Like in India, we have restriction on percentage of the shareholding in different sectors. So is there anything, or in all sectors I can have 100% shareholding?
You can have, 100%. There's no requirement for having minimum local ownership.
In any sector?
No. I think very, very limited situations. I think in certain limited situations, if it was for security, the government could block foreign ownership, but very, very rare. No exchange control restrictions. So if you set up a company, you can repatriate dividends. The other type of business is an LLP, which is a limited liability partnership. It's a hybrid structure, hybrid between a company and a partnership. It's different from a partnership. It's limited liability.
And one more thing, either limited company or LLP, you need minimum 2% or only 1% can do it?
For LLP, you need two parties.
Okay. And for limited?
One shareholder only.
One shareholder can have all 100%?
100%.
But unlike India, in India, we need minimum 2 people.
We used to have a minimum of two shareholders. Now one shareholder, and that could be a company, or it can be an individual.
Okay, that's great.
When we set up a company here, we have a relatively new requirement to register who has got control of the company. So we must register anyone who's got significant control. Anybody with 25% or more of the entitlement to vote, the equity, the directors, will have to register that on the company's house.
Okay. And what about director meetings? That has to be done in UK, or it can be done anywhere in the world?
You can have your directors meeting anywhere in the world. You can have your directors meetings remotely. The registered office must be in the UK.
Okay. 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 I think most of the things, initial things are clear to the audience who are listening. And I think we can also tell to our clients these things at initial. Yes, let's proceed. Yes. Good.
Okay, so interesting, LLPs were originally used mostly by professional businesses, by lawyers, accountants, surveyors, architects. But we have a number of commercial clients who decide they will trade through an LLP. Some are UK businesses. We had another professional services business which was owned partly by a US company. And it's tax transparent. So the LLP doesn't get taxed. The tax is assessed on the individual members. So it's quite a useful structure for certain circumstances. And the third alternative—
There is no tax on LLP. It is a pass-through status to LLP.
Absolutely pass through. Interesting, a very interesting structure. So it can own a property, but then the rental on that property is assessed on and the profits are assessed on the individual members. And the third alternative for an overseas business is not to set up a company or a limited partnership, a limited liability partnership, just to open an office. You can have a branch or establishment in the UK. But most people will decide they will set up a company. If anybody wants to do this, we would consider with them and with their tax advisors what is the best method of structuring this. Let me tell you just a bit about the tax rates. So corporation tax rates in the UK are 19%. I've got a question mark there because we're not sure whether there's going to be any movement in rates. There was a proposal to reduce those rates further. It's possible they might be reduced now post-COVID, but I don't think corporation tax rates will move. VAT is 20%. I said maybe reduced to 10%, but I think there will be a reduction in VAT, but I don't think it'll be as much as that. That's the sales tax. If you employ people in the UK, then the employers have to pay national insurance contributions at a rate of 13.8% on their salaries. And that's also something which is being currently considered. Companies must pay business rates on their property. And that's been a big issue for retailers. In the high streets, business rates are very high. And a lot of retailers are complaining that they're paying business rates, and online sellers are not paying business rates, and they're not paying sales tax. And so there is talk about introducing a digital sales tax of 2 or 3% on turnover. So that is something which I think will happen. I mean, the OECD are considering that there might be an international move, but at the moment, that is being considered a digital sales tax.
I think, David, a question has popped up because I think we have to run fast because other members are there. So, but there is another, because a lot of questions are coming, so I have to keep on asking you because there is one question just has popped on my screen. And I'm just reading the question. If there is a company, I mean, you can answer in a line also. If there is a company who has some ready product design, which are not manufactured in UK, but the company has only intellectual property and no funding available. So now what the question is there any preferential funding or other facilities available? Potential to do annual, this particular business, IP has a potential to do business of around 60 million pounds in about 3 years. So any preferential finance or any facilities available in UK for such kind of thing, where they have a business idea and IPR which can be which can be converted into a big business?
There were research and development grants. So if it's under development, you could apply for research and development grants. Okay.
So I think if somebody want to know more about it, they can directly approach and put an email to you or email to us, and we can have a detailed reply to us. to this?
Yes, it's not a straightforward issue, but we can advise on that, look at that. I've got one slide left, so I'll move quickly because I know that time has moved on.
Yes.
And so we've spoken about the possibility of setting up a new business. A number of clients, a number of our clients have decided that they will expand into the UK, not by setting up a new business, by acquiring an existing business. And we handle a lot of inward investment work. We've done that over a period of years. People from Europe, from the US, from Far East, all over. So that is an alternative to relocation. Again, as I said before, there's no restriction on foreign ownership. So you can come and take over a business here, acquire 100% of the shares. And there's a very well-trodden path of Indian businesses, not only setting up here, but acquiring businesses here. You know, some of our famous brands, Jaguar Cars is owned by your huge conglomerate Tata. Tetley Tea is owned by Tata as well. And I think I did a bit of research. There were around 850 companies, Indian companies, currently doing business in the UK with a combined turnover in excess of 48 billion. So, Samir, I'm hoping that with your clients and with this audience today, we're going to turn that into 50 billion next year.
Yes, yes.
So thank you again for your time. I'm sorry I've overrun. And
it's good. It's so thank you, David. I mean, it was really an excellent, I think, questions I have already taken along with you. So we had crossed only 1 hour for your session. It was so interesting and lots of questions has come up. And now we know that the Indians, they can acquire a company or they can have a single shareholder, what company we should buy and how the things should be done, what is the business sector. So all information, perspective of a corporate perspective you have given to us. Thank you very much. I think the audience are asking whether you will circulate this slide. So I will inform the audience that whole presentation of this webinar will be circulated after the webinar to all the participants. And for the information of the audience and for the panelists, that we are live, this session is live on YouTube as well. So it is being watched in YouTube as well. And these slides and the profile of Wallace and David and Bibi and Daniel will be circulated to the participants, and they will have all freedom and all chance to contact them to take their assistance. So with this, I think, friends, now I would invite Bibi to give a property aspect of UK, and I think we have to run fast, and I think that is also a very important aspect of a business when we talk about doing business in anywhere in the world. So Bibi Fakhri, you are most welcome to have your session, please.
Bibi, you're on mute.
There you go. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you, Samir. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. David has already talked about the political paralysis that Brexit caused last year and the preceding years to that. And that had an effect of causing a downturn, and certainly in the number of property transactions that we saw last year. But with the general election in December and the decisive results of that, we were seeing at the beginning of this year a real trend for increased transactions and increasing values in property. And that was continuing at the beginning of March. So it shows how late the market was waking up to COVID and something that was probably shared politically. But as soon as it became clear, I think in the third week of March, that we were heading for a lockdown, everything almost overnight, all the deals we were dealing with went on ice. So there was immediate stopping of almost all transactions. But it slowly has picked up again. And as we are coming out of lockdown, we are seeing the market now hotting up again and deals being lined up. So that is a short term, and we are seeing that as, the short term effect of COVID was the stopping of the transactions, but the long term effect has been a turbo boosting of whatever trend was there before. And I'm going to go through that in more detail, but I'm going to concentrate on three particular sectors of commercial property: corporate occupiers, by which I mean offices; retail, hospitality and leisure, by which I mean shops, restaurants, gyms, hairdressers, hotels, and everything that you normally see in a town center and people go to and spend their money on. The other one is logistics, and by that I mean warehousing.
There's a question here, somebody is asking me that when an Indian or any company is coming to UK, what is better for them, to buy an office or to take it on a rent? So as per you, what makes more commercial sense in this given condition?
I think rental, but you have to be careful in terms of especially if you're just starting out, unless you want to make a permanent investment without knowing the space that you're going to need and whether or not you're going to have a long-term presence here. For now, I would say rental, but you have to be careful as to what terms you're going to sign up to. So certainly you do not want to commit to something long-term with high rents.
So what percentage of rentals have come down? Has the rentals come down, or what's the status?
Well, I think people are holding out. They will come down, they will have to, because the demand is going to fall. But landowners are being reluctant. They are used to a certain level of income. They have possibly debt that they need to finance. And so it's not going to be overnight, but I think it's going to come, and it is already coming.
Yes.
So the other one I was talking about is logistics and research and development. And by logistics, I mean warehousing, distribution centers, and research and development, effectively labs and biolabs and tech hubs. So going to corporate occupiers, some of these things David has already mentioned, so I will just touch on them. And I've noticed that one of our sponsors is a co-working operator, so I'll be careful as to what I say here. The trend has been for co-working, and that is going to continue, but we expect that to become different. We expect there to be a landlord curating its tenants with a mix of co-working spaces and private traditional spaces with communal areas, and landlords offering enhanced services and perks that usually you will see a co-working operator providing: the nice coffee, the bar, the yoga sessions, all that stuff that comes with co-working operators.
I think there is a good opportunity for Indian co-working spaces to have a joint venture with UK co-working spaces, where they can collaborate and give a solution to their clients who are having both the offices, both the places.
That's right. But we are also seeing a lot of landowners becoming co-working operators themselves. And you have that with Land Securities and British Land, two of the biggest commercial landowners in the UK, launching their own co-working models. And that's because they've had experience, or they see some of the operators as not good governance and unsustainable business model. And they are worried that they are heavily going to be geared to covenants that might not be secure in the long term. And they are also saying that they will have to provide those perks to their own traditional tenants. Those tenants, so they might as well just roll it out for the whole building. And do it themselves. But that means you can't be a passive investor, i.e. you can't just buy a property and then wait for someone to take up a floor and for the rent, and then all you do is effectively collect rents and provide some basic services. You actually have to become a business that is running a co-working business and not just be a passive landowner. And that's not something a lot of landowners understand, but that is, or understand how to run. So we expect maybe, rather than where you've had, for example, WeWork taking long leases of office buildings or multiple floors of buildings, translating to operators entering into operation sort of type agreement like you have with hotels. So it will either be owner operated or an operator management agreement type model rather than a tenant landlord model. So what are we seeing in terms of how it is going to translate for our corporate occupiers in terms that we're going to see, and how is that going to translate into lease terms? Now, leases for years have been a particular model, very much geared in favor of the landlord, very one-sided, and we expect to see that change. And that was already starting to change with the introduction of things like landlords having to take a hit on uninsured risks. And incidentally, we expect COVID to become treated very much like an uninsured risk under a lease, i.e. if
Maybe what happened during COVID when things were locked down, was a force majeure applied for rent over there or not? What is the situation?
Well, that's interesting. And there has been a lot of discussions amongst lawyers and occupiers, including retail and all sorts of tenants. And the short answer is that there is no force majeure provisions in leases. And it is very difficult to establish force majeure. Your asset is still there, your building is still there, it's just that you can't use it. So no, and that is something that no one had ever considered before or had to consider before. We are going to see force majeure, not so much that, I don't think we're going to have force majeure going forward clauses that effectively say your lease is an end if there is a force majeure situation where you can't use your real estate, but more that you don't have to pay the rent, and the hit is going to be expected to be taken up by the landlord as an uninsured risk. And for 10 years ago, as I said, that it was always expected that the tenant was to take the risk on uninsured risk, and uninsured risk was typically something like terrorism if cover was not available on insurance market at reasonable terms. And it's now going to extend to almost all force majeure situations, and not just for damage or destruction, but your inability to actually use and utilize your space.
One question is, can maybe what is the, I mean, if I'm a Asian or outside a non-resident to UK, then can I come and buy a property? Is there any restriction of buying a property, or what is the requirement? Is there any restriction to buying?
There are no restrictions in property ownership in the UK as to who can own. Typically, it is owned by companies, commercial property, rather than individuals, but it can be owned by LLPs. So no, there are no restrictions.
If I'm Indian residing outside UK, for example, I'm residing in Delhi and I am not permanently residing in UK, can I buy a house there, and is that okay?
Yes, but only recently, in the past couple of years, you are penalized on the tax that you pay when you acquire property, which is stamp duty land tax here. And that applies, it's not necessarily just on foreigners, but if you own a second home or you're not replacing your main residence, i.e. effectively you're buying as an investment or buy to let, you are going to pay a hit, and that is a considerable hit, particularly in London where property values are high. So you're looking at a 3% penalty, which they're actually thinking about increasing on top of the normal SDLT rates. And residential property has become a very difficult thing to invest in, and the tax on it has become incredibly complex. Hence why a lot of people we are seeing prefer now to invest in commercial property, but you have to be savvy with commercial property. It's harder to understand, and you have to understand the market better, and you have to understand who you're going to rent to. So going back to lease terms, we are going to expect to see shorter terms with the ability to get out sooner. So this is going to be possibly, I mean, the norm at the moment is for a term of 10 years, and we are going to see a lot of people insisting on year 5 ability to walk away and break, or having multi-tiered leases. So this is where a company, for example, or a business has multiple floor occupations in a building, each one being held on separate leases that are not linked, so they can be disposed of or terminated as and when the need for space changes. And that is one of the things that COVID has caused, is the uncertainty that you don't know how much space you're going to need going forward. And that's why with the focus on cost cutting, I can't see people signing up to long-term liabilities where they don't actually know whether they're going to need this space or whether this space is actually going to work for them. So that in itself mean a reduction in values of rent, and that in turn means a reduction in the value of the asset, underlying asset. So that is even going to be more pronounced in retail. Retail as a traditional model where you've got multiple outlets on every high street was already in decline. It cannot compete with the e-commerce model. You're effectively providing a window where people come and touch things, but then go and buy it somewhere else for cheaper. And that is expensive. And David mentioned business rates. Business rates have been crippling for retail. There are currently a business rates holiday where you don't have to pay the tax to the local authority for effectively occupying the unit.
In retail, is there arrangement like in India, if you go to high street malls, or the rent they charge it on sharing or revenue, or it's on sharing basis?
So that is going to be the trend, and you already have that in shopping centers, but you already have in shopping center leases or town center leases, for example, where you've got shopping destinations. For example, Covent Garden, if people are familiar with London, or Soho or the West End, you already have a large base rent, and then also on top of that, a rent that's geared to revenue. So effectively a bonus for the landlord. This already we are negotiating, and this is our existing contracts where people are bound by those terms. We are seeing a re-gearing of those leases towards, at least for a certain period, totally geared to revenue. And with very, very small base rents. So there's a small percentage where the landlord knows at least is going to get that, and cap service charges. So at least that's geared to totally to turnover. is very unusual at the moment, but that is what we're going to see. Certainly, is the significant part of the rent is going to be geared to turnover. But I've already mentioned the force majeure situations that will equally apply to retail, and we're going to see that as the norm. For retail and hospitality and services, there's been a total, unless they've got online offerings, there's been total stop on all revenue, whereas with corporate occupiers, at least they've still been able to work at home and generate business. So I can't see going forward anyone signing up to a lease where they can't, but there is a liability on them to pay rent when they can't trade for no fault of their own. And if you ask me, you know, we were negotiating leases a month before lockdown, and if I had suggested that to the landlord, or someone had suggested it to me as acting for the landlord, I would have said no way. But now I think if you want a tenant, this is what you're going to have to agree to. And also what is going to see again is short leases. And with retail, I think we're going to see rolling breaks, i.e. we can basically terminate at any time on X amount of months notice. And also, again, having capped exit costs, and this is the terminal dilapidation liabilities, and agreeing at the outset what we should pay you when we leave the building or the unit. All this has, of course, go on.
One more thing, is there a funding? Suppose I'm a company and I want to buy maybe a real estate or a office or a house, and is there any funding available to buy it or something like that by mortgaging the property itself, or is that facilities available to foreigners?
No, very little. You can get funding from banks and funders, but not government-backed schemes where you're effectively incentivized to buy property. Some properties you might get tax breaks on because you're either utilizing or regenerating or utilizing, for example, environmental breaks, because you are cleaning up a brownfield site, or you are regenerating an area, and you might get planning breaks in those situations where you might not necessarily have to pay the levies that you're expected to pay if you're a developer to develop those type of sites. But no, generally there is no currently, and I can't really see the government having the appetite for effectively. Landlords are seen as people who have money, and that is currently not going to be the government. It's not going to be a vote winner for anyone to start helping landlords, and we haven't seen it. All the focus has been on helping retail tenants and leisure and hospitality tenants at the moment. So turning to evaluation and funding implications, it is going to be difficult to value a property where you have previously valued it on the basis of yield if A, you don't know what the yield is going to be because it's now predominantly geared to turnover, and you don't have security of how long you're going to have the rents coming in, because your tenant can give you notice and walk away at short-term notice. So in the short term, I think properties that have already have leases in place with good AAA covenants that are locked in for the next 10, 20 years are going to be in demand. And those are the properties that are going to be valuable on the market, because that's the model that people understand. And they can see for, okay, if I put my money into this asset, this is how much at least I'm going to get per year. So if you are just starting out and you are looking at a site that you're going to develop and fill it, you might be trying to take away the retail and those kind of uses from it. But that has planning implications, and we don't think that planners certainly are going to anytime soon allow town centres to become void of those type of offerings. What's going to happen is that retail is going to be replaced by more service type offerings that you can't get online. So hairdressers, nail bars, micro gyms, yoga studios, restaurants, bars. I know those kind of things at the moment are not possible because of lockdown, but there is a real appetite for them to come back. And people are, you know, as David said, you know, if you've got 500,000 people turning up at a beach, they want to go out and they want to spend money. But they want to spend money not on things they can buy online, but rather the experiences. And one of the interesting things, for example, is when people, we've got clients who run escape room games, i.e. this is where you go and effectively try to solve puzzles to move from room to room with friends over an evening. And there has been a lot of resistance from landlords to change, to apply for planning and change use from retail, which is traditionally seen as valuable use, to uses that allow for those kind of uses. But I think we're going to see that they have to do that, and that's going to be the offering. The high street is going to be more offerings of services and leisure and hospitality rather than pure retail, or possibly a mix. So you will have a shop that's selling things, but also offering you added on services, personal services. And that's what we're going to see. So very quickly on logistics and research and development, this has been a boom for logistics, not just because of COVID, but because of Brexit as well. And the need for stockpiling and not knowing how trade is going to pan out. So this is a continuing growth, everything, not just warehousing and distribution. For example, with COVID, you've got a situation where hardly any cars have been sold. You've got a mass backlog of cars that manufacturers can't shift, and they have to be stored somewhere. Planes, you know, almost so many things. You've got with Brexit potentially having the possibility of having to deal with lorry parks where to clear customs, particularly if there is no deal when we leave on in December. But there's also a shift for demand for sites in central urban areas. And that is tricky because you need planning, you need convincing town planners to allow you to have these sites, but also real estate in urban areas is expensive. You don't want to be sinking a whole lot of money in a warehouse. But we're seeing that the trend is to try and have it in central areas simply because demand, the logistics, particularly for food deliveries, has not been able to cope with having out of town hubs that service large urban centers, for example, like London. Biosciences is going to benefit from huge investments, and it's already doing, it's already a boom sector, and COVID has again turbocharged that. There's a lot of money going in biosciences, so the need for sites is going to increase. And bioscience is one of those uses that you can't necessarily do at home. You can't work from home if you work in a lab. So we are going to see that becoming much more attractive investment to landowners. Something that was probably quite niche before is probably going to come to the fore and be much more attractive. But again, it requires the landlord to be flexible in terms of changing use of its property, but also considering taking on tenants that could potentially be startups. And then thinking about what other securities they could have. So just to round it up, what are going to be the growth areas and investment opportunity? Something I haven't really touched on, but it's the trend has already been for well-designed, sustainable buildings. Sustainability And being green is very important to certain tenants who are good covenants, because it fits their social profile and the social responsibility platform. And that is something that the landlords have to deliver on if they want those type of tenants. And those are the good tenants. So you need to cater for that, and you need to design well-designed spaces that have potentially a lot of areas which are not traditionally rented, i.e. the communal areas, the terraces, the experience that the building has to offer, because you have to provide a service to attract tenants to come to your building, and those tenants themselves need to attract their workforce to come to the building. So what landlord is going to be successful? The landlord that's prepared to be flexible. In the short term, that might mean a landlord that's willing to take a risk, is cash rich, because flexibility doesn't always translate well to lending, because lenders tend to be cautious and are looking at traditional models for valuations. So the opportunity lies for a landlord that's prepared to put the work in, not just be a passive investor. And that is about providing services. As I mentioned, tax, I'm not expecting any tax breaks to resuscitate the realty market, simply because it's not politically, I don't think, viable. But equally, I am not expecting taxes to increase. And the low interest rate is going to help in itself, I think, rather than tax breaks. So that was it.
So thank you, Baby. It was a really, nice presentation, nice information about the reality and the property sector in UK. And now the Indian companies, or any company who is willing to go in UK and trying to set up, that there's no restriction. You can buy the property. And I think if I'm correct, if they approach you, can help them in connecting to or transacting there. If they need some offices or something, or help, you can help them. I'm telling through this webinar, I'm suggesting them, if they want any assistance on this particular issue, they can contact you and you would be able to help them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vivi. Yeah, thank you. Friends, last but not the least, I think Daniel has very little time. He has to run fast, but it's a very, very important issue now we are going to run through, which is related to employment. And one very interesting, which I was talking to to Daniel before this, regarding entrepreneur visa, and we need to know about that, because India at the moment, lot of startups, lot of entrepreneurs are growing, startups are going international, many startups are setting up their headquarters, their businesses in US, UK, Australia, and different parts. So many of them are going to UK as well. So I would like to hear Daniel, and welcome, Daniel, and let's hear you on the subject.
Thank you, Samir. I'm talking to you from my home office in North London, where I've been since mid-March. But unlike many of my friends who've done no work since mid-March, as an employment lawyer, I've been very busy. I've got lots of slides, but I'm conscious that we're already at the hour-and-a-half mark. So I'm going to go through them at a super rapid pace, possibly missing things out here and there. Bear with me one moment. The slide is not changing.
Yes, yes.
Apologies for that. Okay, so in Britain we have a workforce of 33 million, so slightly smaller than the population of Kerala. So in Indian terms, pretty small, but still a lot of people. And about 25% of those are currently furloughed. That is a new concept in English law, introduced in March, which means they are working at home and their employers are funded by the government up to £2,500 per person to keep them at home and not dismissed. The workforce is divided, as you would expect, into employees and self-employed, but we also have a third category, which derives from European law, and that is workers. And workers are people who have some employment rights, but are not treated exclusively as employees, and they're certainly taxed as though they are self-employed. So let's have a quick look at what rights the workers will have. They have the right to the national minimum wage, which is £8.72 an hour. They have a right to be enrolled automatically into a pension scheme set up by their, well, not their employers, because they're not employees, but the person they're working for. And the employer has to contribute 3% into that. They have protection from discrimination, which we'll talk about later. They have whistleblowing protection, which we'll talk about later, and their working time is controlled. So these are quite significant rights.
So Daniel, in India, there is a situation where the number of employees increases a particular limit, say 10 or 20. Then only most of the labor law or employment law applies. Is it so in UK as well?
No, it's you can have employment rights if you just have one employee. If you employ a housekeeper in your home, that person will have employment rights. The size of the employer has no bearing on it whatsoever.
So this is a big difference between India and UK, because here things are a bit different. It starts applying when you are more than about 10 and 20.
Yes, which is very similar in Germany, actually. But here, it doesn't matter. But what does matter is whether you're a worker or an employee. So these people who have these rights are people who contract personally to do work where the relationship is not one of business and client. So as a solicitor, I would never be a worker for one of my clients because there is a business and client relationship. But if you engage somebody to work for you personally, they are likely to be a worker unless they can delegate the work to someone else, in which case there's no obligation of personal service and this doesn't apply. So those are the rights that workers have. Quickly, which rights do employees have? They have all of those workers' rights that we've just looked at, and in addition, some family leave rights, so maternity leave, paternity leave, adoption leave, shared parental leave, which is a new concept, which involves the mother giving up her maternity leave and passing it to her partner, who can then take the balance of it, even though he may work for a different employer. And they also crucially have protection for against unfair dismissal after 2 years service. And we will look at that also later. So first of all, let's have a quick look at the rules around working time. And this is something that applies to not only employees, but also anybody working for you who is a worker, so anyone with an obligation to provide a personal service. And the biggest is that you have to provide them with paid holiday. And this is why there are many cases on the subject, and people who engage staff try to resist the suggestion that they have workers. Uber, for example, the taxi service, their drivers have been held by the court to be workers, even though they are, according to Uber, self-employed people driving their own cars, but they are workers and they're entitled to 5.6-week holiday a year. What a week means, it depends on you and how much you work. So if you have a 5-day-a-week working week, then 5.6 weeks holiday is 28 days a year, which is essentially our 8 public holidays plus 4 weeks off. If, however, you work just 4 days a week, then it's 22.5 days. If you work just 1 day a week, that's 5.5 days. We also, under European law, have a limit on the average hours you work a week. So it's not an absolute bar in any week, but you're not supposed to work more than 48 hours a week. But Britain, being reasonably Eurosceptic, negotiated so many carve out from that piece of law that it is not a particularly important part of employment law, and most employees opt out of it. Because of the time, I'm going to skip through the rest of this slide. and move to discrimination. So discrimination is unlawful in the UK on 9 separate grounds, or 9 protected characteristics. The first of this is age, and that is protecting people from discrimination whether they are young or old. So unlike in the States where people who are over 40 are protected, this is not just something designed to protect people who suffer discrimination because they're older. Also, someone who doesn't get a job because they look too young could be protected. Disability, mental or physical, gender reassignment, marital status, that's an interesting one. That actually only protects married people. I think the concept is that single people don't suffer any discrimination. This was introduced because we used to have something called the marriage bar. So when a woman got married, she was expected to leave work up until the late 1960s in some places. So that is now made unlawful. Pregnancy discrimination, self-explanatory. Race, that covers nationality, ethnic origin. Religion, that is whatever religion you happen to be, or a lack of religion, so atheists are protected. Also belief, so that is any philosophical belief that governs your life. So it might be being a vegan could be protected. However, the courts are at pains to make sure that offensive beliefs cannot be protected. So for example, somebody who said that they were a white supremacist wouldn't be able to gain protection under this law because the case law says that the belief has to be worthy of respect in a democratic society. Sex and sexual orientation. So that is whether you are heterosexual, homosexual or bisexual. And it actually doesn't matter whether you are that, so you have that sexual orientation, because people who have been teased in the workplace for being gay when everybody knows they're not gay can claim this form of protection. Discrimination comes in 4 separate forms. So direct discrimination is saying, I won't give you a job because you're a woman. That is unlawful. Indirect is placing barriers that adversely affect one group. So again, sticking with women in the workplace. In society, statistically, more women are primary child carers. So if you have an absolute requirement that everybody has to work full time, that could be indirect discrimination against women. Indirect discrimination is only unlawful where it can't be justified. So sometimes you can justify people needing to work full time, sometimes you can't. Harassment is creating a hostile working environment for people on the grounds of one of those protected characteristics. And victimization is retaliating against somebody who has complained that they have been discriminated against. And this is where the big money is. And I do lots of discrimination cases because not only can you get compensation for injury to feelings, not on the US scale, you can't retire on your compensation. As it says on the slide, it's capped at £45,000. But you can get unlimited compensation for financial loss. So if you feel that you've lost your job because of discrimination, you can claim 2-3 years money. Some people who suffer mental injury, a lifetime.
What is this injury to feelings? This is dangerous. I mean, what is feeling?
Yeah, well, it can be anything from being offended through to suffering from a mental breakdown. And the compensation varies accordingly. So, in people's witness statements, they will say, I suffered sleepless nights, I had sweaty palms whenever I saw this person, I lost my appetite.
Suppose if I scold somebody in office for something, and can that person say I am having my feelings, my injury of feeling is happening and all those things if I scold somebody in office or what, like that?
Yeah, yes. If you were found to have discriminated against that person, they may be awarded compensation for the unpleasantness that they had to go through. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, I mean, audience to note, this is, when we are operating in UK, we have to see this because these things we don't have in India, but I think these things are to be noted while you are operating in UK.
This is big. I mean, this is one of the biggest parts of my job. Whistleblowing protection is very similar. You get compensation for injury to feelings. You get unlimited compensation. And this is to protect people who blow the whistle to their employer about a breach of a legal obligation. So we're not complying with the regulatory rules, or there's fraud going on. People used to blow the whistle about breaches of their own contracts of employment, but that loophole was closed about 10 years ago by the second bullet point on that list, which is that the disclosure must be in the public interest. Unfair dismissal is our basic employment protection. This only applies to employees and is a political football. So it was introduced in the 1970s by a Labour government, and at that time, it was a protection you got after 6 months. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government came in the 80s, increased it to 1 year, then to 2 years. In the late 90s, we had Labour again with Tony Blair, he brought it down to a year, and in the 2010s, we have Conservatives again, so they brought it back up to 2 years. So essentially, for an Indian employer coming to the UK for the first time, as long as you don't discriminate against people, you have a 2-year trial period to decide whether you like them or not, whether they're the right employee, before they suddenly get protected employment. If they have protected employment, you can still dismiss. It's not like Germany, where if you do it wrong, the dismissal is void. It's not like Denmark, where you have to apply to the court for a license to dismiss in advance. You can dismiss, but it may be held to be unfair. Potentially fair reasons are listed there. So you've got conduct, the employee's behavior, capability.
So up to 2 years, there is no unfair dismissal.
After 2 years, that's it's not that there's no one. After 2 years, if you dismiss somebody without following the right procedure, they can get compensation, and the compensation is set on this screen. So it's the lower of a year's salary, or £88,500.
Oh.
So
even if I dismiss somebody after a few months, then also it is.
There's no issue. As long as you comply with their contract, they can't complain of unfair dismissal. However, they might complain that you dismissed them because they were Indian, or because they weren't Indian, or because they were a woman, or because they were homosexual. So they can bring a discrimination claim, but those are difficult to prove. So to show that your dismissal is fair, it could be for redundancy, so reduced requirement. It could be for the person's performance, or because they're too ill to do the job. But the key thing is following a fair procedure, and there's different fair procedures for each head.
Is there is a possibility that if the employment agreement are drafted in a particular style or effectively, some protection can be made out of this?
No, this is impossible to opt out of. The only way you could opt out of it is by ensuring that the person is not actually an employee and trying to engage them on a self-employed basis. But that in itself could lead to a dispute.
So instead of employee, I engage them as a consultant.
Yes.
Okay.
However, if you're their only client and they're working for you full time and they do what you say, then the courts will say, it doesn't matter what the contract says, this person is clearly your employee. So to be a consultant, you need someone who is bringing their own equipment, their own laptop to work. They work whatever hours they choose. If they want to take work from other clients, they can. And those people can establish that they are not employees, although they may still be workers. So you may still have to pay them for holiday. At the moment, we have avoided big redundancies in the UK because of the furlough scheme. So as I said, 25% of employees.
And if somebody is asking, what if an employee is not performing? Then what?
If an employee is not performing and that employee has 2 years service, then you've essentially got a choice. You go through a fair procedure, which means that you explain to them why they're underperforming, that this underperformance could result in dismissal, and you give them a chance to improve, and you have to have regular meetings with them about whether they've improved or not. Roughly takes about 3 months. What most people do is they come to a deal with the employee, they pay them a sum of money, and the employee signs a settlement agreement saying, I won't take you to an employment tribunal, and accuse you of unfair dismissal. I won't accuse you of discrimination. And in return, you give me 3 months money. And that's the common way of doing it.
Okay.
Redundancies are potentially...
From a law point of view, if he's not performing and I don't want to give any extra money, and if he's really not performing, then what is the recourse to me as an employer?
Then you need to go through that procedure of giving him time to improve and warning him. So there's a very strict procedure that you have to go through. I mean, the practical advice is that you deal with it in the first 2 years, because you have 2 years to decide if somebody is good. But if their performance drops off after 2 years, you can dismiss them. It just takes some time. Or you can dismiss them and pay them the compensation, because the compensation is capped.
Okay.
Clearly, there's been a huge downturn in the economy. There are a lot of businesses that aren't expecting at any time to get back to their pre-COVID levels. And there are going to be a lot of redundancies looming. And these have been delayed because of the furlough scheme, but they are coming. And my clients are starting talking to me about that now.
So what happened in COVID situation in India? So many people have, big giant multinationals, they have removed thousands of people. So what are happening? They are paying, or what is that situation?
Well, these
COVID,
people are being furloughed. So the people are at home and they're being paid up to £2,500 a month, which their employers claim back from the government. And that's the furlough scheme. But the furlough scheme,
in COVID situation, can they remove the employee?
they can, yeah. But at the moment, there's no particular reason to do so. However, the furlough scheme is going to end at the end of October. And until October, it's tapering down. So the government contribution is reducing. So suddenly the employers are thinking, well, if I don't want this person back in 2020, we're going to need to terminate. However, there is a control on that, which is the first bullet point on this slide. If an employer is proposing to make at least 20 redundancies at one establishment in a 90-day period, then it must consult collectively with the workforce. So this is consulting with the trade union, if there is one, or works council, if there is one. And if there isn't one, you need to hold elections and elect staff representatives and consult with those people for 30 days if you're making between 20 and 100 redundancies, or 45 days if you're making over 100 redundancies. And if you fail to do that, all of the employees can get up to 90 days pay as compensation. So that can be hugely expensive. 3 months pay for 90 staff that you're getting rid of could be a lot of money. This law, however, isn't quite as far-ranging as it sounds, because an establishment is not necessarily one company. So, for example, if you are a retail chain, you could probably argue that each of your shops is a separate establishment. So if in each shop you're just losing 5 people, this law doesn't come into play. But if you've got one single establishment, a head office, for example, as soon as you're planning to get rid of 20 people, this law comes into play. That's the collective law, but then individually, anybody who's got 2 years service, we remember, has the right not to be unfairly dismissed. And there is a procedure for that around consulting them. So basically, you can't present them with a fait accompli. You can't say you are redundant. You have to say, we're thinking of making you redundant. You listen to what they have to say. You have a consultation period of about a week, and then you can confirm the dismissal. And if they think it's unfair, they can go to an employment tribunal. Also, if they think it's discriminatory, so he selected the Muslims, I'm going to complain to an employment tribunal. So again, unless you do deals with the individual employees and pay them extra money, there is always the chance that they are going to complain and take you through legal action following a redundancy dismissal. That's a very quick whistle stop of employment. Let's touch on immigration for a moment. This, however, is hugely temporary because, as David was discussing, we have left the European Union. We are currently in a period where we're acting as though we hadn't, the transitional period, but we have actually left, and as of next year, this country will have its own immigration rules, and these are all probably going to change. Key things at the moment, though, we have two types of visas. Tier 1 visas are for investors. This is serious money. This is £2 million or plus. Tier 2 visas are for skilled workers, and you have to get your job first, and your new employer has to sponsor you, and they have to apply for a sponsor license from the Home Office. They have to be paying you a minimum salary set by the Home Office, and they have to advertise the job here and show that they can't find a suitable person here for the job. And then they put in all the evidence for that, and the employee can be sponsored. And as mentioned there's also a language test for people coming in.
So Daniel, for example, I'm a company, I have set up a company in UK. I'm from India, I have set up a company in UK, and I want to take along my managers or people from India. So what kind of visa or what kind of thing I need for that?
Well, the first thing you might do is actually the third bullet point on that slide, which is you can send one senior manager over as a sole representative of the company. Okay. And that person can now come over for 2 years to set up a UK branch or a wholly owned subsidiary. If you then want to bring more people over, then you use the intra-company transfer rules, which are part of tier 2 visas. So you would get those people to tier 2 visas, but they would need to be skilled workers. So you cannot say, I would like my receptionist from India because he or she is great and knows the business. No, they need to be a skilled worker, and the Home Office will say you need to recruit your receptionist from the local workforce. There's also a few new visa categories, one of which you mentioned at the outset. We have the startup visa, and this is if you have an innovative idea. You have to get it endorsed by an educational body, so something like a university over here, or an organization that supports entrepreneurs. And then with that endorsement, you can apply for a startup visa, but there's a very high, strict test about how innovative and genuinely new and viable the idea is.
So which universities in UK are attesting this innovative idea?
Sorry, I missed the question.
I mean, which educational or academic institutions in UK are certifying this innovative idea?
It would be universities.
All government accredited universities or private universities as well?
Well, nearly all of there's very few private universities in the UK. They're nearly all, there's a system of universities. I mean, they are private, but they're not essentially run as businesses.
It may depend upon the accreditation which they have got, something like
yes, it depends on their accreditation, yes. So there are lists of who can accredit the idea. We've also got the innovator visa, where you have to have £50,000 to invest in your new business. And also the global talent visa, where organizations like scientific bodies can endorse you as being of exceptional talent, and then you can apply. But all of these are incredibly narrow, and I think it's very important to remember that the agenda in the UK in recent years has been to attempt to reduce immigration, including business immigration, because although there's big pressure from business to keep it open, there are headline figures about the amount of people coming in, and politicians like headline figures. and like to say that the amount of immigration is coming down. And
So this,
obviously,
a startup visa, I mean, is it restricted to a particular country or any person from any all over?
any person from anywhere. So historically, for the last 40 years or so, we've had very different rules with Europe and the rest of the world. And before that, I guess we had different rules with the Commonwealth and the rest of the world. But suddenly, now we're leaving the European Union, everybody is the rest of the world. But obviously, as things progress, we may strike individual trade deals with certain countries, which might include immigration arrangements. But at the moment, we're moving to a state where people from India shouldn't be treated any differently from people from France or people from Germany or Italy. Ireland, I think, always has been and always will be different, but generally, there should be now no difference between Europe and the rest of the world. And that comes to the end of our presentation.
So Daniel, I think one more question. There are a lot of, I mean, this is from the students, maybe some students are also there, because because India and UK has a very long relationship. I mean, even in history and business, both, when a lot of professionals are working there, there's a huge Indian community residing there, a lot of students are going there. So what is for, I mean, the students who are going there, what is, I mean, they can do job, what is the system of that?
There's a big campaign at the moment to extend the rights of students, because it's very important for UK business that we get students over. And there is a perception that people are now less likely to come, and that we need to increase the employment opportunities. So there's been a recent change. I mean, again, I'm glossing over it hugely because it's very complex and detailed, but essentially you come over here and then you can stay for 2 years and work. And there's, I heard a politician being interviewed on the radio the other day saying this needs to be increased to 4 years. So I think that probably that's going to be a positive area, because we need your students.
Yes. Yeah, I think, Daniel, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Daniel. It was really, I mean, wonderful 360-degree view of the employment in a very short time. And we are already half an hour above our scheduled time, and still our audience are there and they are listening. One of the comments which I have just received, one of the audience is saying the session is absolute solid. I mean, they are very happy to listen to this whole session, which is available on YouTube as well. So friends, people have been asking the contact details of Wallace, for David. So I am just for the ease of the audiences over here, I am just running down, and the people were asking. So the contact details of the David are here. You can go to the website of Wallace, which is given over here. The contacts of Fakhri Bibi is over here, and the contact details of Daniels are here, and these are available on YouTube as well, and you can go to the website as well. So friends, with this, we have finished our Q&A session along with the sessions of the speaker, and a very hearty and extended thanks to all our panelists for finding time and being with us for, I think, more than around 2 hours now. And it was a pleasure to hear all of you. And audience, you have been a great audience, and you have been putting a lot of questions to us. And I think we all enjoyed the session. It was really an insightful session. And for the audience who want to receive an e-certificate, they can mail it at New Delhi at India Juris. And this is our upcoming webinar on 4th July, Saturday. Those who wish to attend this, they may register on this. So with this, we close our webinar. Thank you all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samir. Excellent.
Thank you.